The silence in the room felt so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the cell phone screen, those words that were so simple and, at the same time, devastating. My foolish husband thinks I'm going to work, but little does he know that I'm going to meet you. The message pounded in my mind, each syllable echoing like thunder. I reread it several times, hoping my eyes were playing some trick, but there was no mistake. There it was, blatant and irrefutable, the confirmation that my world, so carefully constructed, was about to collapse. At that moment, I felt my heart split between the pain of a discovery I never expected and the anger that was beginning to take over every fiber of my being. Memories raced through my head, the complicit smiles, the shared plans, the promises said in moments of intimacy. Everything seemed to dissolve like smoke. Something in me, however, refused to accept silent defeat. If there was something more behind that message, I needed to know. More than that, I needed to see it. It was with shaking hands that I took the car keys, without thinking about the consequences, and decided to follow her. The journey to the destination seemed endless, each red light a cruel reminder of what I might encounter when I got there. My mind, in a whirlwind, oscillated between scenarios of what could be happening and questions that I feared would never have answers. What did he have that I didn't have? How long had this been going on? Was it a momentary betrayal or a premeditated choice? When I parked near the restaurant, my heart almost jumped into my throat. There they were. Sitting at the table by the window, their faces lit up with smiles that seemed to belong to a couple in love, not a married woman and her lover. My blood boiled, but my legs went still. Should I go in and confront them there, in front of everyone? Or should I wait and watch? A part of me wanted to scream, to cause a scene that would never be forgotten. Another part, perhaps the more rational one, knew that it needed something more. Evidence, context, a moment that was so crushing that they both felt the pain I felt now. I decided to wait. The clock ticked every second as if it were an eternity. When they finally left, side by side, with an intimacy that made me feel sick, I decided to follow them. It was too late to back down, and something inside me told me that this chance encounter was just the tip of a much darker iceberg. It was in a hotel parking lot that they finally stopped. As she laughed at something he said, I felt my vision narrow. I entered immediately, being careful not to be noticed. The receptionist greeted them naturally, handing over a room key as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The tightness in his chest became more intense. I climbed discreetly right after them, keeping enough distance to not be seen, but close enough to register every detail. When I finally saw them enter the room, it was like something inside me broke forever. Back in the car, my body felt paralyzed. Anger now shared space with silent despair. I needed to decide what to do, but every scenario my mind projected seemed to lead me to a dead end. The images of the two of them together, laughing and exchanging complicit glances, were engraved in my mind. The urge to go back there, to knock on that door and demand answers, was almost irresistible. But something in me said that wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted them to feel the same emptiness that I felt now. As the sky began to darken, my mind dreamed up possibilities. All I knew was that it wouldn't end there. It couldn't end there. And as I swallowed the pain and planned my next steps, only one question remained in my mind: how far was I willing to go to make them feel the weight of the choices they made? And now, I wonder, did they really think this would be without consequence? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not tolerate any type of betrayal. All the stories you will hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can devastate lives and destroy precious bonds. Our goal is to explore the emotional consequences and lessons these intense dramas teach us. Get ready, because now you are going to hear a shocking story, full of twists and turns. Take a deep breath and enjoy. The red brick house with large windows and a well-kept garden seemed perfect for the couple everyone described as exemplary. Andrew and Julia had the kind of relationship that, to those looking in from the outside, was a mixture of harmony and complicity. Andrew was methodical, a respected accountant at a local firm, known for his patience and attention to detail. Julia, on the other hand, was a free spirit, an art teacher who exuded creativity and warmth. Together, they seemed to complement each other's gaps, forming an almost palpable balance. Their 12-year marriage had, until then, been marked by moments of simple happiness, Sunday afternoons spent in the garden, long conversations over dinner and occasional trips to picturesque places. Andrew loved how Julia saw the world with curious eyes, always ready to find beauty where no one else saw it. She, in turn, admired the stability and security Andrew provided, especially at times when her own impulsive nature threatened to take control. He was her safe haven, she was the wind that made his life less predictable. However, in recent months, something subtle seemed to have changed. There were no fights or explosive arguments, just small gaps that appeared between conversations. Andrew had noticed how Julia spent more time on her cell phone, but he always attributed it to work or exchanging messages with students. She, in turn, noticed that he was increasingly immersed in work, bringing spreadsheets and reports home. It wasn't an obvious break, but rather a crack that grew silently, almost imperceptibly. The mornings were routine and peaceful. Andrew got up early, made coffee and read the newspaper while Julia was still asleep. He used to look at her, still tangled in the sheets, and think how lucky she was. Julia, when she woke up, felt grateful for that man who, although predictable, was a constant in her life. But at some point, the charm of small gestures began to be lost. Cups of coffee were no longer accompanied by smiles, and "good morning" messages became automatic. On that particular Tuesday, as Andrew prepared coffee, he felt a pang of nostalgia. He remembered how they used to talk about their dreams, how they spent hours imagining the future together. What had changed? Was it work that consumed them? Was it the weight of years, of routine? He wondered if Julia felt this way too, but he didn't have the courage to ask. Julia, on the other hand, felt caught between the desire to keep things as they were and a restlessness that she didn't know where it came from. It wasn't that she didn't love Andrew, but something inside her longed for a spark that had disappeared. That same night, Julia arrived home later than usual. She explained that she had to stay longer at school to organize a student art exhibition. Andrew believed without question, as he always did. While she showered, he prepared dinner, a ritual he repeated on nights when he knew she would arrive tired. Julia went downstairs, with a different expression on her face, and praised the smell of the food, but it seemed absent. They talked about trivial things during dinner, but neither of them touched on what they really felt. The following weeks followed a similar pattern. Andrew remained immersed in his work, while Julia became increasingly involved in school projects. She seemed excited about her painting classes and extracurricular activities, and Andrew was convinced that her new energy was just a reflection of her passion for teaching. He didn't see the subtle signs, the messages exchanged on her cell phone more frequently, the different sparkle in her eyes when she talked about the day. One afternoon, while Andrew was organizing his files in his office, he found a birthday card that Julia had given him years ago. The words were full of love and promises of a future together, but now they seemed distant, almost from another life. He found himself wondering if he had stopped being the man Julia admired. Maybe he was so focused on providing stability that he forgot what really made her happy. Andrew sighed, feeling a weight he didn't know how to ease. Julia, in turn, was immersed in her own contradictions. She loved Andrew, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. At times, she felt guilty for thinking that way. After all, he was good, kind and had never done anything to justify his displeasure. But, at other times, she felt suffocated by the monotony that seemed to have settled between them. It was as if she was living on autopilot, fulfilling the expected roles but without really feeling it. One weekend in particular brought an opportunity for both of them to reconnect. Andrew suggested they spend Saturday together, revisiting some of the places they used to frequent early in their relationship. Julia accepted the idea with a smile, but inside she was torn. They walked through the park where they had their first date, had lunch at the restaurant where Andrew asked for her hand in marriage and ended the day with ice cream in a small square. It was a pleasant day, but when they returned home, Julia felt even more uneasy. It was as if the memories reinforced the contrast between what they had been and what they had become. Andrew realized something was wrong, but decided not to pressure her. Maybe she was just tired, he thought. He preferred to believe that this was just a phase, that everything would return to normal with time. But the truth was that the silence between them was becoming unbearable, an invisible barrier that neither of them knew how to cross. At that moment, the two were on the edge of a precipice that they could not yet see. The love that once seemed unwavering now faced the relentless forces of doubt and emotional distance. While Andrew stared out his office window that night, wondering how he could regain what he felt he was losing, Julia was in another room, lost in thought and questioning what she really wanted. Both were on opposite sides of the same maze, searching for answers they didn't even know how to formulate. And in the midst of it all, a cruel truth hung over them, a truth that would transform their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. The weeks following the weekend at the park brought a growing sense of restlessness to Andrew. He tried to fill the empty spaces with more gestures of affection, more effort to be present, but it seemed that the closer he got, the more distant Julia became. She smiled and said everything was fine, but her eyes told a different story, a story Andrew couldn't decipher. Conversations that once flowed naturally now seemed calculated, as if she carefully chose each word. He wanted to believe it was just the stress of work, the demands of school, but something inside him whispered that there was more. Julia also felt the weight of silence, but her emotions were a chaos that she could barely control. The days at school were busier than ever, the responsibilities were piling up, and she found herself spending extra hours on a project that was supposed to be exciting, but which only served as an excuse to not face what she was feeling at home. Every time she saw Andrew, every time he tried to connect, she felt a pang of guilt that made her look away. There was a rift forming between them, and she knew she was the cause of it, even if she didn't want to admit it. One particular afternoon marked the beginning of what would be a series of choices that Julia could never undo. She was organizing materials in the school's studio when Ethan, a colleague who had recently started as a music teacher, came in to get something. Ethan had a relaxed manner and an easy smile that made everyone around him feel at ease. He and Julia had exchanged a few words here and there, but that afternoon, the conversation went on and on. She told him about the exhibition project and he enthusiastically offered to help. The friendly tone quickly turned into an exchange of confidences, with Julia sharing more than she should have about her frustrations, about how she felt her life had lost some of its luster. Ethan listened intently, offering words of comfort that, at that moment, seemed like exactly what she needed. Andrew, in turn, began to notice small details that made him uncomfortable. Julia, who had always been organized, seemed more scattered. I would forget scheduled dinners, leave early and return later. He tried to shake off the insecurity, telling himself it was just a phase. However, one night while Julia was sleeping, he saw her cell phone flashing on the bedside table. The urge to look was strong, but he resisted it. He didn't want to be the kind of man who spied on his wife, but the doubt was planted and, over time, it grew like a shadow he couldn't ignore. Julia and Ethan began spending more time together, under the guise of finishing preparations for the exhibition. They shared quick lunches at school and texted each other late into the night. Julia's guilt was a constant burden, but Ethan's attention was addictive. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that she didn't love Andrew, but Ethan represented something new, something that stirred emotions she thought were lost forever. The lines between friendship and something more began to blur, and Julia found herself increasingly involved. Andrew tried once again to rekindle the connection. He planned a surprise dinner at home, featuring Julia's favorite foods and wine he knew she loved. But when she arrived, exhausted and distracted, she thanked him without enthusiasm and went straight to the shower. He realized something was wrong, but instead of confronting her, he kept his feelings to himself. After that night, he decided he needed to know what was going on. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a feeling that the woman he loved was slipping through his fingers. One morning, as Julia was getting ready to leave, her cell phone vibrated on the table. She was upstairs, and Andrew, without thinking, looked at the screen. It was a message from Ethan. "I need to talk to you." He felt his heart racing and left his cell phone exactly where it was. There wasn't enough evidence, just a name and a suspicion, but that was enough to plant the seed of an idea that he couldn't ignore. That night, Julia said she needed to stay late at school to finalize the last details of the exhibition. Andrew watched her as she spoke, analyzing every word, every gesture. She seemed nervous, but he pretended not to notice. He waited for her to leave and, after a few minutes, he took the car keys and followed her. The anxiety was almost unbearable. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something inside him told him he needed to see for himself. When he parked near the school, he saw Julia and Ethan leaving together. They laughed, as if sharing a secret. Andrew stood still, watching as the two of them got into Ethan's car. He followed them at a safe distance, each kilometer covered adding to the weight in his chest. When the car stopped in front of a small restaurant, Andrew parked across the street, trying to control his breathing. Julia and Ethan came in, sat at a table near the window, and Andrew saw everything. The way their eyes met, how the smiles were different from the ones she shared with him. He stood there, watching, as they talked and laughed, as if they were the only couple in the world. When they finally left, Andrew followed them again, this time to a discreet hotel. His stomach dropped when he saw Julia take Ethan's hand and walk in with him. Andrew stood still, unable to move. What he had seen left no room for doubt. He felt a wave of emotions ranging from anger to sadness to a sense of betrayal so deep he could barely breathe. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about Julia, seemed to have shattered. He knew that this was just the beginning, that he needed to find out what else was hidden behind Julia's actions. And, as he stood there, staring at the hotel's illuminated facade, a single question echoed in his mind: why? Andrew was silent for days after that night. The scene of Julia entering the hotel with Ethan replayed like an endless movie in her mind. He didn't confront her right away, and that wasn't for lack of desire. He needed time, clarity, answers that justified each choice she made. When Julia was at home, he watched every gesture, every word that now seemed loaded with a hidden meaning. She smiled as easily as before, but Andrew saw beyond the smile. He saw the hesitation, the moments when she seemed lost in thought. He saw the woman he still loved, but who was now almost a stranger. That morning, Andrew decided to take action. He called Julia home for a chat, something that made it feel more intimate, less formal than confronting her in public. When she walked downstairs, her face seemed relaxed, not suspecting what was coming. He waited until she was sitting on the couch before speaking, his hands clasped and his voice calm but firm. "I need to ask you something, Julia. Something that has consumed me, and I need you to be honest with me." For a moment, she seemed to freeze, as if his words carried a weight she already imagined. Andrew stared at her, searching for something in her eyes, a reaction that would confirm or deny his suspicions before she even responded. Julia looked away, trying to maintain her composure. "What are you talking about, Andrew?" His voice was soft, but there was a note of nervousness there. He leaned forward, crossing his arms over his knees. "I followed you the other day. I saw you with Ethan. At the restaurant. At the hotel." The words came without hesitation, and he let them hang in the air between them. Julia took a deep breath, her eyes wide, but then she looked down. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He continued, anger and pain mixing in his voice. "I don't know how you managed to do that. I trusted you, Julia. We built a life together, and now it all seems like a lie. Julia finally found her voice, but it was faint, barely a whisper. "It's not what it seems, Andrew. I know it feels wrong, but—" She trailed off, the words dying before they took shape. He shook his head, frustration growing. "Isn't it what it seems? So tell me what it is, because I can only see you laughing with him, holding his hand, walking into that hotel." He stood up, pacing back and forth. "Tell me what I'm not seeing, Julia, because I'm trying to understand but I can't." Julia slowly stood up, her eyes now shining with tears. "I didn't want it to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you." Andrew stopped and stared at her, waiting for more. "Why then? Why him? Why is that?" His voice was broken now, the anger giving way to the pain. Julia hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Because I needed something that I couldn't find here anymore. I needed to feel alive again." Her words were like a punch. He recoiled, as if he had been physically hit. But that didn't justify anything. He wanted to understand, but the emptiness inside him only grew. "I've always been here, Julia. Always. So why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to fix this before you threw everything away?" Julia looked at him, her eyes full of guilt. "I tried. I tried so hard, but I just didn't know how." The silence between them was interrupted by Andrew, who turned his face away, trying to hide the tears that were now flowing. "So everything was easy for you, right? To fake. Deceive me. I thought I knew you, but now I see I was wrong." He turned to her again, this time with renewed determination. "But there's something I need to tell you, something that changes everything." Julia looked up at him, confused and scared. Andrew took a deep breath before continuing. "Ethan isn't just any man, Julia. He is married. And do you know with whom? With the woman who has been helping me gather evidence against you too." The surprise on Julia's face was instantaneous. "Like this?" She spluttered in disbelief. Andrew crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on her. His wife, Megan, knew everything. She knew about the messages, the departures, even that hotel. "And we decided it was time to confront you." Julia looked like she was about to break down. Her breathing became rapid, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just heard. Andrew, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He knew that this revelation was just the beginning of the final confrontation, and that the consequences would be devastating for everyone involved. And as he looked at Julia, still in shock, he realized that, despite everything, there was still something he needed to discover, the real reason behind all of this. Julia remained silent, trying to process the impact of Andrew's words. Each sentence seemed to resonate with a weight she couldn't bear. The revelation that Ethan was married, that his wife knew everything, and that Andrew was conspiring alongside her to expose them was like a knife that cut through any defense she might have tried to build. Julia's face was pale, her eyes fixed on a distant point as her mind struggled to find some kind of answer. But there was no excuse. There was no justification that could erase what she had done. Andrew watched her, but the initial satisfaction of having the truth thrown at her was beginning to be replaced by a feeling of emptiness. He wanted it to make him feel better, for the revelation to be enough to ease the pain, but it wasn't. Nothing he said or did seemed to bridge the gap that now existed between them. Finally, Julia looked up, and her voice was weak, almost inaudible. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Andrew? Why didn't you confront all of this before letting things get to this point?" The answer came quickly, almost automatically. "Because I needed to be sure. I needed to know that I wasn't going crazy, that it wasn't just my imagination. And most of all, I wanted you to have the chance to tell me the truth yourself. But you didn't say. You chose to lie, Julia. He chose to betray." He took a step back, as if he needed room to breathe, as if her proximity was an unbearable weight. Julia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. I messed up. I know that. But I never wanted that to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I just... Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Andrew interrupted her, his voice filled with anger and hurt. But it happened, Julia. You hurt. You destroyed it. It doesn't matter what you wanted or didn't want. What matters is what you did. And now, there is no going back. He turned away, unable to look at her any longer, and began walking around the room, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. Julia watched him, anguish evident in her every movement. Finally, she found the strength to speak again. And what happens now? What are you going to do? The question hung in the air, and Andrew stopped, slowly turning to face her. I haven't decided yet. Part of me wants you to go away right now, out of this house and out of my life forever. But another part is still trying to understand how this all happened. How we got here. Julia took a step forward, her voice firmer but still shaking with emotion. Andrew, I know my words may not mean anything right now, but I'm sorry. I made horrible choices, and I hate myself for it. She hesitated, fighting back tears. I love you. I have always loved you. And maybe that doesn't make sense to you, but it's the truth. Andrew let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Love? Do you call this love? Julia, love is not lying. Love is not cheating. Do you want me to believe this is love? She reached out, as if she could reach him, as if her touch could undo everything. But he stepped back, the gesture as simple as it was devastating. Don't touch me, Julia. Not now. I can't. I can't deal with this. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overflow. We need space. We need time. I need. He stopped, his voice breaking. I need to find out if there's anything left between us worth saving. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Julia didn't know what to say. Every word seemed wrong, insufficient. She felt that any attempt to explain, to justify, would only make things worse. Andrew finally broke the silence. Megan wants to find you. She wants answers too. Julia's eyes widened, surprised and scared. Why? What does she want from me? He shrugged, his gaze blank. Maybe she just wants to hear your side of the story. Maybe she wants to understand why you and her husband decided that your needs were more important than the compromises you made. Julia swallowed, her throat tight. She knew that meeting Megan was inevitable, but the idea of facing her, of facing the pain she had caused, was terrifying. When? Where? Andrew looked at her for a long moment before responding. Tomorrow. Here. Julia nodded slowly, feeling the weight of yet another conversation that promised to be as devastating as the one she had just had. That night, the house seemed bigger, colder. Julia stayed awake for hours, pacing back and forth, while Andrew remained in the office, the door closed. They were both trapped in their own thoughts, in the memories of what they had been and in the fear of what would come next. Julia knew that whatever happened the next day could determine the future of them all. And for the first time, she realized that maybe not all stories ended with a second chance. Dawn brought a cold light to the house that once seemed to warm Julia and Andrew with the promise of a solid future. Now, every corner of the place seemed to echo with the remnants of a life they both barely recognized. Andrew was in the office, the sound of the keyboard being the only evidence that he was still around. Julia, in turn, was in the living room, her gaze lost on the cup of coffee she was holding, forgotten in her hands. The encounter with Megan hung like a shadow over her, a reminder of the chaos her choices had unleashed. She knew there was nothing she could say to undo the damage, but she also knew she needed to face the consequences. Andrew came downstairs later than usual, the expression on his face filled with emotional exhaustion. He didn't say anything as he passed Julia, but the silence between them was more deafening than any argument could be. She watched as he grabbed a glass of water and leaned back against the counter, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Finally, she found the courage to break the silence. "Did you sleep?" The question came out more as a whisper, hesitant. He shook his head, not looking at her. "Not a lot." The words hung in the air, without follow-up, with no intention of continuing. Julia wanted to say more, but the invisible barrier that separated them seemed insurmountable. Andrew, on the other hand, was fighting the urge to confront her again, knowing that nothing would change until Megan arrived. He needed to hear what Megan had to say, needed to understand if there was any truth that could bring clarity to the confusion that consumed him. When the sound of a car pulling into the driveway finally broke the tense silence in the house, Julia felt her heart quicken. She stood up slowly, as if every movement was an internal battle. Andrew remained where he was, motionless, as Megan's footsteps approached the door. When the doorbell rang, he cast a quick glance at Julia before walking to the entrance and opening it. Megan entered with a firm stance, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Julia. She was a woman with a strong expression, who seemed to carry with her a determination that Julia envied at that moment. "Thank you for having me," Megan said, her voice calm but filled with a coldness that made each word heavy. Andrew nodded, indicating the sofa. Julia stood for a moment, uncertain, but finally sat down next to Megan, feeling the tension between them almost palpable. "I won't take up much of your time," Megan began, looking directly at Julia. "I just want to hear from you. I want to understand why you thought it was acceptable to do what you did." The question, simple in its wording, brought out a wave of emotions in Julia that she could barely control. I don't know where to start," Julia admitted, her voice shaking. Megan crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "Start with the truth. Just the truth." Julia took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that seemed as fragmented as her life at that moment. "I was unhappy," he admitted, finally lifting his eyes to meet Megan's. "It's not an excuse, I know that. But it's the truth. I felt disconnected, lost. And Ethan showed up at the wrong time, or maybe the right time, depending on how you look at it. He made me feel alive." The words came out with difficulty, but once said, they could not be taken back. Megan remained impassive, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Alive. So you decided that your need to feel alive was more important than the commitment you made to your husband? More important than the family Ethan has with me and our children?" Julia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of Megan's words as a fair and irrefutable accusation. "I never wanted it to be like this. I never wanted to hurt anyone," Julia whispered, but even to her, it sounded empty. Andrew watched silently, his jaw tense as he tried to process what he heard. He knew Megan was right. He knew that nothing Julia said could justify what had been done. But there was something about her vulnerability, the way she admitted her mistakes, that made him question whether the anger he felt was enough to erase the years of love and companionship they had shared. Megan let out a heavy sigh, uncrossing her arms. "You know, Julia, what hurts me most isn't just the betrayal. It's the fact that you both knew what you were doing and went ahead anyway. You chose this. You made conscious decisions, and now we, Andrew and I, have to deal with the consequences of your choices. That's not fair." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Julia knew Megan was right, but there was nothing she could say to soften the impact. Finally, Andrew spoke, his voice low but firm. "And now? What do we do now?" He looked at Megan, then Julia, waiting for some answer, some way forward. Megan met his gaze, and for the first time, the coldness in her eyes seemed to have softened. "I don't know, Andrew. I really don't know. I think at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to decide what comes next." Julia felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the exchange of looks between the two. She knew that she had somehow destroyed something in Andrew that might never be fixed. But he also knew that, deep down, there was still something between them, something that might be worth fighting to save. The question was, would Andrew be willing to try? After meeting Megan, the house fell into an almost unbearable silence. Julia spent hours sitting alone in the room, reliving every word spoken, every judgmental look she received. The conversation had left a deep mark, as if each sentence was an invisible scar that she would carry forever. Andrew, in turn, isolated himself in his office, the door closed as a shield against everything the world seemed to want to impose on him. He knew the future was now in his hands, but the choice seemed impossible. He didn't know whether he should fight for what was left of his marriage or leave everything behind and seek a new life. The next day, Julia tried to start a conversation with Andrew. She found him in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee as if he was lost in thought. When she entered, he looked up briefly but said nothing. "We need to talk, Andrew," she began, her voice hesitant but determined. He sighed, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know if there's more to say, Julia. You destroyed everything. Everything we build. I can't even look at you without wondering where I went wrong." Julia felt the weight of his words but refused to give up. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you in a way that may never be repaired. But I want to try. I want to fight for us." For the first time, Andrew looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "To try? To fight? You should have thought of this before, Julia. Before you betray my trust, before you destroy what we had. Now, I don't know if there's anything left to fight for." His words were like knives, but Julia knew she deserved every one of them. She tried to get closer, reaching out her hand, but he retreated, creating a physical distance that reflected the emotional barrier between them. "It's not that simple, Julia. You may want to fix things, but I don't know if I can. I don't know if I want to." As Julia faced the emptiness of a marriage that seemed to be falling apart before her eyes, Andrew began searching within himself for answers. He spent sleepless nights, rummaging through memories of the past, trying to find a moment, a sign, anything that could explain how everything had gotten to this point. But instead of answers, he only found more questions. He thought about Megan, about the pain she was going through too. He thought about how their lives had been intertwined by choices he had never made, but which now had the power to define him. Megan, on the other hand, had decided to move on. After the confrontation with Julia, she packed Ethan's bags and placed them outside the house. When he arrived, he tried to argue, ask for forgiveness, but she was unshakable. "There's no more room for you here, Ethan. Not after what you did." He begged, promised to change, but she knew the words were empty. Megan had spent enough time ignoring the signs, trying to save something that, deep down, was already lost. Now, she was determined to rebuild her life, even if it meant starting from scratch. Andrew and Megan continued to stay in touch, initially out of necessity, sharing information about the divorce process. But over time, conversations began to expand beyond what was strictly necessary. They talked about their days, their frustrations, their hopes for the future. What started as a practical exchange turned into something more. There was a connection between them, a mutual understanding that seemed to arise naturally from their shared experiences. Andrew began to realize that while Julia represented the past he was trying to overcome, Megan was a door to something new. Julia, on the other hand, began to face the consequences of her actions in a more tangible way. Her relationship with Ethan had ended abruptly and acrimoniously, and she found herself alone, trying to find purpose amid the chaos she had created. She returned to focusing on work, dedicating herself entirely to school and projects with students. It was an attempt to fill the void, but also a way to avoid confronting the realities of his personal life. However, even in the midst of work, she couldn't escape the shadow of her choices. Every conversation with Andrew, however brief or cold, was a reminder of what she had lost. Months passed, and Andrew finally made a decision. He found Julia in the living room one night, her face serious but serene. "Julia, I thought a lot about all of this. About us. About what we were and what we have become. I don't hate you, but I can't stay with you either. It's not fair to any of us. I need a fresh start." Julia listened to his words in silence, tears streaming down her face. She knew this was the end, but somehow it also felt like a relief. Not because she wanted to break up, but because there was finally clarity. Finally, they could move on. Andrew began to rebuild his life, and Megan became an important part of that process. They didn't rush into anything, but there was something between them that was undeniable. A connection that seemed to grow with each conversation, with each casual encounter that turned into something more meaningful. Julia, on the other hand, began to reconnect with herself. She sought therapy and started painting again, something she had abandoned years ago. Little by little, she found a way to make peace with herself, even if the past could never be completely erased. In the end, everyone involved carried the scars of what had happened. But at the same time, these scars were reminders of growth, of resilience. Andrew found new love, not in the midst of overwhelming passion, but in the stillness of someone who understood his pain and helped him see a different future. Julia learned to live with her choices, accept the consequences and seek a life that was more honest with herself. Megan, in turn, discovered her strength, her ability to rise again even when everything seemed lost. Now that we've reached the end of this intense story full of twists and turns, we want to know what you thought. Comment below your opinion, tell us how you felt when you heard this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support cheating of any kind. Our goal is to show how these choices can devastate lives and how important it is to value relationships and trust. Until the next story.